Before we begin, listen closely. This is not a story about criminals. This is a story about workers who were turned into prisoners, men who asked for fair pay and were answered with prison bars. What you are about to hear was almost erased from American history. If you care about real true crime stories that expose the hidden side of power, prisons, and injustice in the United States, subscribe now. Because stories like this are not taught, they are buried. And once you hear what happened to these miners behind bars, you will understand why. Let's begin. The iron door slammed shut so hard it shook the stone walls. Inside the dark jailhouse, the men did not scream. They did not beg. They stood still, their hands bruised, their clothes torn, their faces blackened with coal dust and dried blood. Outside, guards laughed as the keys turned. The sound echoed through the hallway like a warning. These were not thieves. They were not killers. They were coal miners. Men who had worked underground since they were boys. Men who had dug America's fuel with their bare hands. Now they were locked inside filthy cells, charged like criminals for one reason only. They refused to bow. In the coal towns of the 1890s, prisons were filling fast. Not with hardened criminals, but with workers, union leaders, fathers, teen boys who followed their dads into the mines. The jails were overcrowded, unheated, and watched by armed guards hired by the coal companies themselves. And tonight, something was about to break. In one cell, a miner whispered through the dark. In another, a hand tapped a secret signal against the wall. Across the jail, men who had nothing left decided they would not eat, not one bite, not until someone listened. The guards thought the prisoners would give up by morning. They were wrong. By sunrise, the jail would no longer be just a prison. It would become a battlefield. And what happened next would shock the nation. But to understand how miners became prisoners and how prisons became weapons, we must go back to where the war truly began. Long before the jail doors closed, deep underground. In the late 1800s, coal was king in America. Coal powered trains, factories, and homes. Without coal, the country stopped. And the men who mined it worked in some of the most dangerous conditions on Earth. Coal miners lived in company towns. The company owned the houses, the stores, even the schools. Miners were paid in company money called scrip, which could only be used at company stores. Prices were high, wages were low, accidents were common. Every day, miners went underground not knowing if they would come back alive. Cave-ins, explosions, poison gas. Death was always waiting. When miners were injured, they were fired. When they complained, they were replaced. If they tried to organize, they were marked as troublemakers. Still, they tried. In the late 1890s, miners across states like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky began forming unions. They asked for safer conditions, fair pay, shorter hours, simple things. The coal companies answered with force. They hired private detectives and armed guards. These men carried rifles. They broke up meetings. They followed union leaders. They beat workers in the streets. Some towns felt more like war zones than communities. Then came the arrests.
Sheriffs loyal to coal owners began rounding up miners. Union organizers were charged with crimes they did not commit. Some were accused of conspiracy, others of disturbing the peace. Many were jailed without real trials. Prison became a tool. The goal was simple: break the spirit of the workers. Inside the jails, conditions were terrible. Cells were packed beyond capacity. Men slept on stone floors. Food was barely enough to survive. Sick prisoners were ignored. Letters from families were withheld. The message was clear. This is what happens when you fight back. But something unexpected happened behind those bars. The miners did not turn on each other. They did not give up. They organized. Quietly, carefully, they turned the jail into a meeting hall. They shared food. They shared stories. Older miners taught younger ones how to stay strong. Union leaders used whispered words and coded taps to keep hope alive. When guards tried to separate them, it only made them angrier. Then came the hunger strike. One morning, guards pushed plates of thin soup through the bars. No one touched it. At first, the guards laughed. By nightfall, the laughter stopped. Day after day, the prisoners refused to eat. Weak bodies pressed against iron bars. Voices grew softer, but their message grew louder. Word spread outside the jail. Wives gathered. Children waited. Townspeople began to ask questions. Why were miners being treated like enemies? The coal companies panicked. They ordered guards to crack down harder. Prisoners were beaten. Some were dragged into solitary cells. Others were threatened with longer sentences. Still, the hunger strike continued. Then, one night, everything exploded. A guard entered a cell and did not come back out. Shouts filled the hallway. Doors rattled. Somewhere, a whistle blew. Outside the jail, armed men gathered. Inside, miners braced themselves, knowing there would be punishment. What happened next would turn a labor dispute into a national scandal. It would expose how prisons were being used to crush workers, and it would prove that even behind bars, rebellion was possible. As boots rushed down the corridor and rifles were raised, one truth became clear. This was no longer about coal, it was about control, and the prison walls were about to witness something they were never built to hold. Freedom's echo. The gunshot cracked through the jail like thunder. For one frozen second, no one moved. Then chaos exploded. Guards shouted, boots slammed against stone floors, keys rattled as men rushed toward the cell where the struggle had begun. Inside the cell block, miners pressed back against the walls, their hearts pounding. They did not know who had fired the shot. They only knew what it meant. The line had been crossed. A guard lay on the floor, stunned and bleeding from the head, struck by a metal cup during a struggle. He was alive, but the sound of the gun had changed everything. To the men in charge, it did not matter what really happened. Now they had an excuse. Outside the jail, lanterns flared to life. Armed deputies and company guards gathered fast. Some were not lawmen at all, but hired men paid by the coal companies. They carried rifles and clubs. Their faces were hard. They were ready. Inside, the prisoners knew what was coming. The cell doors stayed locked, but the air felt tighter, heavier. A miner named Thomas, no older than 20, whispered that the guards would make examples of them. An older man placed a hand on his shoulder and told him to breathe. They had survived the mines. They would survive this too. But fear was spreading.
The guards stormed the block, dragging men from cells one by one. Some were beaten. Others were thrown into dark isolation rooms barely big enough to stand in. The hunger strikers were hit the hardest. Food was forced in front of them and kicked away when they refused to eat. By morning, the jail smelled of sweat and blood and fear. Word of the violence leaked out anyway. A wife heard from a deputy who felt guilty. A preacher saw bruised prisoners during a short visit. By afternoon, crowds gathered outside the jail. Women held children close. Men shouted questions the guards refused to answer. Why were miners being treated like animals? Why were they jailed without fair trials? Why were armed company men running a public jail? The coal companies tried to shut it down. Newspapers friendly to mine owners printed short stories calling the miners violent criminals. They said the jail riot proved the workers were dangerous. They said strong punishment was needed. But other reporters began asking harder questions. They spoke to families. They followed the money.
They learned that many guards were on company payrolls, not public ones. They learned that miners were arrested for meetings, speeches, even singing union songs. The truth was starting to leak. Inside the jail, the miners paid the price. Days passed. Hunger made them weak. Some collapsed. A few were carried out and never returned to the cell block. The rest did not know if those men were alive or dead. Still, the prisoners resisted. They stopped speaking altogether, using only taps and gestures. They blocked cell doors with their bodies during inspections. When guards tried to separate leaders, others stepped forward to take their place. The jail had become a symbol. Across coal towns, strikes spread. Workers walked off jobs, trains slowed, coal piles sat untouched. The companies responded with more arrests. Jails filled again. Some prisoners were sent far away to break the movement. Others were held without charges. And sometimes, makeshift prisons were set up in warehouses and barns. America was watching. State officials could no longer pretend this was normal law enforcement. Governors received letters. Churches spoke out. Labor groups demanded investigations. Under pressure, hearings were announced. A small crack appeared in the wall of power. Guards were ordered to ease conditions, at least for show. Food improved slightly. Beatings slowed. A few prisoners were released quietly at night to avoid attention, but not all. The leaders stayed locked up. Among them was a man named Samuel, a calm speaker with coal dust permanently stained into his skin. He had organized meetings, taught men to read contracts, and urged peaceful action. The companies hated him most. They planned to break him. One evening, Samuel was taken from his cell and led down a hallway no one else had returned from. The door closed behind him. Hours passed. Then a scream echoed through the jail. The prisoners froze. They knew that sound. When Samuel was dragged back, he could barely walk. His face was swollen. His spirit, though, was not gone. He looked at the men and nodded once. Do not stop. That night, something changed. The miners began singing, soft at first, then louder. Old work songs, hymns, songs about home. The sound rolled through the jail, rising through cracks in the stone, floating into the night air. Outside, families heard it. Guards tried to silence them. They failed. The song spread across towns. People sang in streets, in churches, at mine entrances. The miners' voices could not be locked away. The coal companies realized they were losing control of the story. They pushed for mass trials. Courtrooms filled with shackled miners. Charges were rushed. Evidence was thin. Judges sympathetic to industry handed down harsh sentences. Prison wagons rolled out at dawn. Some men were sent to state prisons known for brutal labor. Others disappeared into chain gangs. Families were left behind with nothing. The Coalfield War had entered a new phase. Not bullets in the hills, but cells and sentences. Yet the rebellion did not die. In prison camps, miners met others like them. Railroad workers, farm laborers, men jailed for standing up. Ideas spread, bonds formed. The system meant to silence them was connecting them. Even guards noticed. These prisoners were different. They shared food. They protected the weak. They refused to turn on each other. Punishment only seemed to strengthen their resolve. Officials grew uneasy.
What if prisons were creating leaders instead of fear? What if injustice was feeding the fire? Then came the letter. A leaked report reached a major newspaper. It described illegal arrests, private guards, and abuse inside Coalfield jails. Names were printed, details confirmed. The headline hit like an explosion. Public outrage followed. Politicians scrambled. Investigations were promised. Some charges were dropped. A few prisoners were released. Others remained forgotten. For the miners still locked away, hope returned, but danger remained. Because power does not let go easily. Late one night, as the jail settled into an uneasy quiet, footsteps approached the cell block again. Not many this time, just enough. The prisoners watched the shadows stretch across the floor. Keys turned, a door opened, and a name was called. The name echoed through the cell block. No one answered at first. The guards called it again, louder this time. The prisoners held their breath. Every man knew that when a name was called at night, it rarely meant something good. Finally, a miner stepped forward. His hands shook, but his voice did not. He said he was ready. The guards unlocked the cell and pulled him out into the hallway. The iron door slammed shut behind him. The sound cut through the jail like a blade. The other miners waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. No footsteps returned. Fear crawled through the cells. Some men prayed, others pressed their foreheads to the cold stone walls. They had learned the hard way that silence could mean anything. At dawn, the truth arrived. The miner had been transferred in secret to a state prison hundreds of miles away. No hearing, no warning to his family, no chance to say goodbye. The message was clear. Anyone could disappear. This was how the Coalfield War was being fought now, not only with guns in the hills, but with midnight transfers, broken families, and fear locked behind steel doors. But the plan did not work the way the companies hoped. Instead of breaking the movement, the prison system began to expose it. Families searched for missing men and found lies. Lawyers demanded records and found empty files. Reporters followed trails that led straight back to coal company offices. Stories poured out. Men jailed for standing on street corners. Teen boys arrested for carrying union leaflets. Miners beaten inside cells while guards looked away. Public anger grew. Church leaders spoke out from pulpits. Labor groups organized marches. Even some politicians began to worry that the truth was too ugly to hide. Under pressure, official investigations finally began. State inspectors visited jails. They saw overcrowded cells, sick prisoners, and armed company guards pretending to be lawmen. Some reports were buried, others leaked anyway. The coal companies fought back. They claimed the miners were dangerous radicals. They warned of chaos if control was loosened. They used fear like a weapon. But something had changed. Americans were starting to see the miners not as criminals, but as prisoners of a system built to silence them. Inside the prisons, the men felt the shift before anyone told them. Guards were less cruel. Beatings slowed. Food improved just enough to keep men alive. Some prisoners were quietly released to avoid attention. When men walked free, they carried stories with them. Stories of hunger strikes, stories of secret songs, stories of prisons turned into schools of resistance. The Coalfield War did not end in one moment. It faded slowly, unevenly, leaving scars behind.
Some miners returned home to find their jobs gone. Others found their towns changed forever. A few never came back at all. But the prisons were never the same. Officials learned a hard lesson. When prisons are used as tools of terror, they can become places where movements grow stronger, not weaker. Years later, new labor laws would be written. Safer conditions would be demanded. Unions would gain power. And behind those changes were men who had once been locked away for refusing to stay silent. Their rebellion did not happen on a battlefield. It happened behind bars. The Coalfield War prisoners proved something dangerous and powerful. You can lock up bodies. You can build walls. You can turn workers into inmates. but you cannot jail an idea once it spreads. And long after the coal dust settled, the echo of those prison songs still lingered, reminding America of a truth it learned the hard way. Sometimes the fight for freedom begins in a cell. If you're still listening, it means this story has you. Take a moment right now. These men were not jailed for violence. They were jailed for refusing to stay silent. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe true crime should reveal truth, not just shock, subscribe to this channel. New real U.S. true crime stories are coming. Stories that dig deep into prisons, power, and forgotten victims. Stay with us, because what happens next shows how far the system was willing to go. The prison gates opened slowly, not with celebration, not with apology, but with silence. One by one, miners stepped out into the cold morning air. Their bodies were thinner, their faces older, their eyes carried memories that would never leave. Some had been locked away for months, others for years. A few walked out alone, knowing their families had moved or fallen apart while they were gone. Freedom did not feel the way they imagined. Outside the prison walls, the Coalfield War was ending, but the damage was already done. Coal towns were quieter now. Some mines were shut, others reopened with new rules and new guards. The companies said things were better, safer, fairer, but the men who had been prisoners knew the truth. Nothing had changed by kindness. Everything had changed by pressure, by voices raised from cells, by hunger that refused to bend, by suffering that became public. The released miners went home and told their stories. They spoke in churches, union halls, and town squares. They showed scars. They named guards. They described prisons where silence was used like a weapon. People listened. Across America, the idea spread that prisons could be used to crush workers just as easily as they were used to punish crime. That scared many. It also inspired others. Labor groups grew stronger. They learned from the Coalfield War. They planned better. They protected leaders. They wrote down names and dates, knowing that history mattered. The coal companies noticed. They became quieter too. Arrests slowed. Private guards were pulled back. Some officials were replaced, not because the companies felt guilty, but because they had learned something dangerous. Too much force creates witnesses, and witnesses create change. Inside the prison system, small reforms began to appear. Inspectors returned. Rules were written. Guards were warned to stay within limits, at least when eyes were watching. But the damage inside the men could not be undone. Many former prisoners could not sleep in the dark. Others flinched at loud noises. Some refused to go near mines ever again. They had escaped one underground trap, only to survive another above it. Families struggled too. Children had grown without fathers. Wives had worked alone, scraping by. Some marriages survived, others did not. The Coalfield War had taken more than time. It had taken pieces of lives. Yet even in loss, something powerful remained. The miners had proven that prisoners were not powerless. That even when the law was twisted, resistance could still exist. That prisons, meant to isolate, could become places where truth gathered strength. Years later, when new strikes erupted, the memory of the Coalfield War stood like a warning. Officials hesitated before using mass arrests again. They remembered the headlines, the songs, the leaked reports. They remembered what happened when the public learned the truth. Some of the former prisoners lived long enough to see change they never expected. Shorter workdays, safer mines, stronger unions, laws that said workers had rights. Others died quietly, their names forgotten by history books, but not by the movement. Their stories lived on in whispered lessons passed to younger workers. Never trust power without watching it. Never believe silence means peace.
Never forget what happens when prisons are used as weapons. The Coalfield War did not end with a treaty or victory parade. It ended with men walking out of prison gates, carrying invisible chains that would never fully fall away. And America moved on. But beneath the progress, the question remained. If it happened once, could it happen again? Could workers still be jailed for speaking out? Could prisons still be turned into tools of fear? Could voices still be locked away in the dark? The answer, history shows, is never simple. That is why the Coalfield War prisoners matter. They were not famous. They were not rich. They were miners. And when the system tried to erase them, they left a mark instead. A reminder carved not into stone, but into memory. That sometimes the most important battles are not fought with guns or flags. They are fought in silence, in hunger, in cells. And the echoes of those battles can still be heard today, waiting for someone to listen. The knock came long after midnight. It was not loud. It did not need to be. In coal towns across America, former prisoners froze when they heard it. Years had passed since the jail doors closed behind them, but fear remembered the sound even when the mind tried to forget. Some men reached for boots. Others reached for their children. A few simply stood still, waiting. Because the Coalfield War was not finished. It had changed shape. No longer open arrests, no mass roundups, no crowded jails filled with singing miners. Instead, there were quiet visits, job blacklists, sudden evictions from company housing, men fired without explanation, families forced to leave town by sunrise. The prison gates had opened, but the pressure never fully lifted. Former inmates quickly learned the truth. Freedom did not mean safety. It only meant the fight had moved into the open air. Coal companies kept lists, names of men who had organized, men who had refused to eat in jail, men who had spoken to reporters. Those names followed them from town to town like shadows. A miner could work for a week, sometimes a month, before a supervisor would pull him aside. The work was no longer needed. The company had decided to go another direction. No reason was given. None was needed. Some men changed their names. Others moved west. A few gave up mining forever. But many stayed and kept talking, because silence felt worse than fear. They had already survived prison. Now they would survive memory. In union halls and back rooms, stories were told again and again, not for drama, for warning.
Do not meet in the open. Do not trust company guards. Do not assume the jail is neutral. Younger workers listened closely. Some had been children during the Coalfield War. They remembered their fathers leaving in handcuffs. They remembered empty chairs at dinner tables. They remembered songs drifting from jail windows. Those memories shaped a new generation. Labor movements grew smarter. They learned how to document abuse, how to speak carefully, how to use newspapers instead of fists, how to make sure arrests did not disappear into silence again. The prisons felt this change too. Wardens became cautious. Guards were told to keep hands visible. Some jails banned private company men altogether, at least on paper. Inspectors visited more often. Records were kept cleaner, not because justice had won, but because exposure had teeth. Still, not all wounds healed. Inside state prisons, former Coalfield War inmates carried invisible marks. Some flinched when keys jingled. Others refused to sleep facing doors. Many avoided friendships, afraid attachment would be taken from them again. A few broke down completely. Prison had taught them how small a man could feel, how easy it was to vanish,
how quickly the law could look away. Those men rarely spoke, but when they did, their words carried weight. They warned that power always looks for quiet places. They warned that prisons are easy places to hide abuse. They warned that workers must watch the system meant to watch them. Years turned into decades. New strikes came, new arrests followed, but something was different now. Every time workers were jailed, eyes turned toward the cells. Journalists asked questions earlier. Lawyers arrived faster. Families organized instead of waiting. The Coalfield War had changed the rules. Not enough to stop injustice, but enough to make it harder to bury. By the early 1900s, America was telling itself a new story. A story of progress, of reform, of fairness. But underneath that story was a quiet truth. Those changes were paid for by men who had once slept on stone floors and refused to eat. Men who had turned prisons into classrooms of resistance. Their names were not in textbooks, their faces were not in monuments, but their impact lived on every time a worker spoke up without being dragged away in the night. And still, history left one final reminder. In a forgotten archive, years later, a journalist found jail records from the 1890s. Pages missing, names crossed out, dates altered. Evidence that even after the scandal, someone had tried to erase the worst parts. The truth had almost been lost. Almost. Because stories had already escaped the walls. That is the danger of prisons used for terror. They create witnesses, and witnesses carry memory longer than stone carries scars. The Coalfield War prisoners were meant to disappear. Instead, they became a warning written into American labor history. That when workers are treated like criminals, prisons do not restore order, they expose injustice. And that lesson, learned the hard way, still waits in the background of every cell block, every strike, every knock in the night. Waiting. The jailhouse was quiet again. Too quiet. Years after the Coalfield War, the stone buildings still stood, their walls stained by time and silence. New prisoners filled the cells now. Different names, different charges, but the echoes remained. Some guards swore they could hear it at night. Soft tapping on walls, low voices humming old songs, footsteps where no one walked. Former prisoners said it was memory refusing to leave. By the early 1900s, officials wanted the past buried. Reports were filed away, records locked, public statements softened. The Coalfield War was reduced to a few lines in history books, stripped of prison cells, hunger strikes, and midnight transfers. But memory does not obey orders. In coal towns, the old men still talked. They sat on porches, hands rough and scarred, telling younger workers what really happened. They spoke slowly, choosing words carefully, like men who had learned the cost of speaking too freely. They told them about the hunger, about the guards paid by companies, about prisons used to scare workers back underground. Those stories spread farther than anyone expected. New labor leaders listened. So did teachers. So did writers. Slowly, the Coalfield War prisoners became symbols, not criminals. Symbols of how quickly justice can bend. Symbols of how prisons can be turned into weapons. Symbols of how resistance survives even when locked away. The prison system felt the pressure. Reformers pushed for changes. Separate juvenile facilities, limits to solitary confinement, rules about who could guard inmates, oversight boards, paperwork, inspections. Not all of it worked. Some of it failed completely. But the silence was broken. Officials now knew one thing for certain. When prisoners speak together, when their suffering reaches the outside world, control becomes fragile. That knowledge stayed with them.
Decades later, during new strikes and protests, authorities hesitated before filling jails again. They remembered the headlines from the 1890s,
They remembered the embarrassment. They remembered how prisons meant to crush a movement had nearly fueled one instead. The Coalfield War prisoners had changed the balance, even if just a little. Some of the men lived long enough to see grandchildren. Others died young, their lungs ruined by coal dust and stress. When they passed, funerals were quiet, simple affairs. No medals, no speeches, no apologies. But sometimes a song was sung, the same one whispered in cells decades earlier. Families carried those songs forward, not as protest, but as memory, a reminder. The Coalfield War was never just about coal. It was about who held power and how far that power would go to keep it. Prisons were supposed to protect society. Instead, they were used to scare it. And when that truth surfaced, it shook public trust in ways that could not be undone. That is the real legacy of the Coalfield War prisoners. Not victory, not defeat, exposure. They exposed a system willing to trade justice for control. They exposed how easily workers could be turned into inmates. They exposed how silence was enforced with bars and locks. And in doing so, they left behind a warning written not in law, but in experience. If prisons are used to silence voices, those voices will find other ways to speak. Through songs, through stories, through generations. The jails may empty, the guards may change, the records may fade, but memory remains, waiting. And every time a cell door closes on someone who spoke out, the past stirs again, asking the same question it asked in the 1890s. Who is the prisoner, and who is afraid? The prison doors closed, the strikes faded, America moved on, but the damage did not disappear. The Coalfield War prisoners were never meant to be remembered. They were meant to vanish quietly behind bars. Instead, they left a warning that prisons can be used as weapons, that workers can become inmates overnight, and that silence is often forced, not chosen. If this story made you think, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you question power, then this channel is for you. Subscribe so these stories are not forgotten again, because the past is never really past, and the next story is already waiting.